The penthouse was a masterpiece of modern architecture, a testament to everything he had built over the last decade. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like a painting, capturing the glittering grid of the city below. Every surface was polished marble or brushed steel, reflecting the ambient light in sharp, cold shards. It was beautiful, immaculate, and utterly lifeless. Alexander walked across the room, his footsteps echoing softly against the hardwood floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by an exhaustion that sleep never seemed to fix. He stopped at the window, placing a hand against the cool glass. His reflection stared back at him, superimposed over the city lights. He saw the lines around his eyes, the gray creeping into his temples. He saw a man who had everything the world said a man should want. And yet, standing in the center of his empire, he felt like a ghost haunting his own life. The silence was broken by the sharp chime of his phone on the glass coffee table. He didn't want to answer it. He wanted to stand there until the city lights faded into the dawn. But the phone chimed again, persistent, demanding. He turned and walked over, picking up the device. The screen lit up with the name Marcus, his executive assistant. Alexander swiped to answer, holding the phone to his ear. "Marcus," he said, his voice rough. "Mr. Thorne." Marcus's voice was crisp, efficient. "I'm confirming the itinerary for tomorrow night. The charity gala at the Grand Hall. Your presence is mandatory, according to the board. They want to see you visible after the merger." Alexander looked out at the city again. "Visible," he repeated, the word tasting like ash. "They want to see the figurehead. They don't care if the man underneath is breathing." There was a pause on the other end. Marcus knew better than to pry, but he also knew the tone of a man on the edge. "It's just one night, sir. There will be donors, investors. And there is a chance she might be there." Alexander's grip on the phone tightened. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "She," he said, though he knew exactly who Marcus meant. "Clara. She's listed as a primary sponsor this year," Marcus explained gently. "Her firm, Aura Design, has grown significantly. She's not just attending, she's being honored." Alexander closed his eyes. An image flashed in his mind, unbidden and sharp. Clara, 5 years ago, standing in the doorway of their old, cramped apartment. She had been holding a box of her things, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. He had been on a call, waving her away, telling her he couldn't talk, that this merger was everything. He had chosen the deal over the goodbye. He had assumed she would wait. He had assumed that his success would eventually be enough to fill the space he left behind. "Did she say anything?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, sir. She hasn't mentioned you. But people talk. She's done well, Alexander. Really well." "I know," he said. He didn't know. He had deliberately not known. He had buried himself in work to avoid knowing. "Send the car for 7. Don't bother me until then." He hung up before Marcus could respond. He placed the phone face down on the table, as if hiding it from view would hide the anxiety creeping into his chest. He walked over to the sideboard and poured himself a glass of whiskey. The liquid was amber, warm, but it did nothing to thaw the chill in his bones. He walked into his study, a room lined with books he hadn't read and awards he didn't care about. On the bottom shelf, behind a row of leather-bound encyclopedias, there was a small wooden box. He hadn't opened it in years. He knelt down and pulled it out. The wood was smooth, worn from handling in the past. He lifted the lid. Inside, there was no jewelry, no money. Just a photograph. It was taken on a beach years ago, before the towers, before the mergers. Clara was laughing, her head thrown back, the sun catching the gold in her hair. She looked free. She looked happy. And she looked like she was looking at him with love. Alexander traced the edge of the photo with his thumb. "What did I think would happen?" he asked the empty room. His voice cracked slightly. "Did I think you'd just pause your life until I was ready?" The room offered no answer. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. He remembered the last thing he had said to her. "I'm doing this for us," he had claimed. But now, standing in the luxury that claim had bought, he realized it was a lie. He had done it for him. For the validation. For the name on the building. He had traded the warmth of her hand for the cold applause of shareholders. He put the photo back, but he didn't push the box all the way back into the shelf. He left it slightly ajar, a small rebellion against the orderliness of his life. He stood up and walked back to the living area. The city lights seemed to blur slightly. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. He wasn't crying, not yet, but the pressure was building behind his ribs, a tightness that threatened to unravel him. He thought about the gala. He He thought about seeing her. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times in his head, usually with a script where he was the savior, where she was struggling, and he could sweep in and fix everything with his wealth. It was an ego-driven fantasy that kept him sane. But Marcus's words echoed. She's being honored. Her firm has grown. What if she didn't need saving? What if she had built something better without him? The thought was terrifying. It stripped him of his justification. If she was happy, if she was successful, then his sacrifice of their marriage was not only cruel, it was unnecessary. He had lost her for nothing. He walked to the mirror in the hallway. He adjusted his collar, staring into his own eyes. "Pull it together," he commanded his reflection. "It's business. It's just business." But the man in the mirror didn't look convinced. He looked tired. He looked like a man walking toward a reckoning. Alexander turned away from the mirror. He couldn't stay here. The walls of the penthouse were closing in, the perfection of the decor mocking his imperfection. He grabbed his suit jacket from the sofa. He needed to move. He needed to be somewhere where the silence wasn't so loud. He walked back to the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He paused, looking back at the vast, empty room. For a moment, he considered not going to the gala. He could cancel. He could hide. But he knew he wouldn't. He needed to know. He needed to see the truth with his own eyes, even if it destroyed the narrative he had built to protect himself. He opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The lock engaged behind him with a definitive click. He walked toward the elevator, his shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. As he waited for the elevator doors to open, he checked his watch. It was early. Too early to go to the venue, but too late to turn back. The elevator arrived with a soft ding. He stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors closed, sealing him in the small, mirrored box, he caught his reflection again. He looked alone. Truly alone. And for the first time in 5 years, Alexander Thorne admitted to himself that the view from the top wasn't worth the climb if there was no one there to share it. The elevator began its descent, dropping him down toward the city, toward the noise, toward the past, and toward the woman who held the key to the only part of his life that had ever felt real. The suspense of what awaited him below tightened in his chest, a mix of dread and a desperate, fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the story wasn't over. But as the numbers on the display ticked down, 30, 29, 28, he knew that whatever happened tomorrow, the man who entered that gala would not be the same man who left this apartment. The emptiness behind him was no longer just a space. It was a verdict. And he was finally ready to face the judgment. He remembered the sound of the waves in that photograph. It was a memory so vivid it almost drowned out the hum of the elevator. The sun had been warm on his skin, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled chill of his penthouse. Clara had been wearing that blue dress, the one with the white flowers. She had asked him to put the phone away. "Just for an hour, Alexander," she had pleaded. "Just be here." He had nodded, put the phone in his pocket, but his mind had remained in the office, checking emails in his head, calculating risks. He had been physically present but emotionally absent. It was the pattern that had broken them. Now, standing in the elevator, descending through the layers of his own building, he felt that same absence. He was descending into the world, but he felt detached from it. The numbers ticked down. 20, 19, 18. Each number was a second closer to the moment he would have to face the consequences of that absence. He wondered if she thought of him. Did she hate him? Did she pity him? Or had she simply erased him, wiped him from her life like a sketch on a whiteboard? The idea that he might be irrelevant to her now was a pain sharper than any business failure he had ever endured. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened to the bustling activity of the concierge desk, the sound of phones ringing, people coming and going. Alexander stepped out, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. He walked through the lobby without acknowledging the greetings of the staff. He pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the night air. It was cool, biting slightly at his face. He hailed a car, not his driver. He wanted to be alone in the back seat. He wanted to watch the city pass by without the barrier of tinted windows. As the car merged into traffic, he looked out at the blur of lights. Somewhere out there, Clara was living. She was breathing, working, existing. And she had done it without him. The realization settled over him like a heavy coat. He had built skyscrapers, but she had built a life. He had chased legacy in steel and glass, while she had found it in resilience. The car stopped at a red light. Alexander leaned his head back against the seat. He closed his eyes. He needed to sleep, but he knew he wouldn't. He knew that tonight was the end of the prologue. The real story, the one he had been avoiding for 5 years, was about to begin. And he was terrified that he wouldn't like the role he had been cast in. The light turned green. The car moved forward. Alexander opened his eyes. He straightened his tie. He prepared his mask. But beneath the suit, beneath the polished exterior, his heart beat a frantic, uneven rhythm, betraying the calm he tried to project. He was going to the gala. He was going to see her. And he was finally ready to admit that he was afraid. Not of losing money, not of losing power, but of confirming that he had lost the only thing that mattered. The city swept past, a river of light, carrying him. The rain began to fall just as the car crossed the bridge, droplets streaking against the window like tears on a cold pane of glass. Alexander watched them race each other, merging and dividing, much like the memories that were now surging uncontrollably in his mind. The driver navigated the wet streets with practiced ease, but Alexander barely noticed the movement. The rhythm of the wipers' swish pause, synchronized with the beating of his heart, slowing it down, dragging him backward through time. The city lights blurred into elongated streaks of gold and red, dissolving the present moment until the interior of the car felt less like a vehicle and more like a time machine. He closed his eyes, and suddenly, the scent of leather and rain was replaced by the smell of cardboard and old coffee. He was no longer in the back of a luxury sedan. He was standing in the living room of the apartment they had shared 5 years ago. It was smaller than his penthouse, cramped with books and plants, but it had been warm. It had smelled like home. Now, in the memory, it smelled like goodbye. The air in the room was heavy, thick with unsaid words that had finally hardened into a wall between them. Clara stood near the door, her hands gripping the handle of a cardboard box. It wasn't a large box, just enough for the essentials, the things she couldn't bear to leave behind. She wasn't crying anymore. The tears had come weeks ago, during the arguments, during the nights he spent at the office, during the dinners he missed. Now there was only a quiet, devastating resolve in her eyes. Alexander remembered standing by the desk, his hand hovering over the phone. It was ringing. The merger. The deal that was supposed to secure his future, their future, or so he had told himself. He looked at Clara, then at the phone. The silence stretched, agonizing and loud. "Alexander," she said, her voice soft, lacking any accusation. That was what hurt the most. She wasn't angry, she was tired. "Please, just put it down." He remembered the justification rising in his throat, ready and rehearsed. "Clara, you know I have to take this. It's the final signing. If I don't answer, the whole deal could slip. This is for us. Don't you understand? Once this is done, I'll have time. I'll be there." She shifted the box in her hands, adjusting her grip as if the weight was physical, not just emotional. "You've been saying that for a year," she replied, looking down at the floorboards. "Every time there's a crisis, every time there's a meeting, there is always something more important than being here, than being with me. It's not about importance," he insisted, stepping toward her, but stopping when she flinched slightly. He hadn't realized then how his presence had become a source of tension rather than comfort. "It's about security. I'm building an empire so we don't have to worry about anything." "But I don't want an empire," she said, finally looking up. Her eyes were dry, but the pain in them was sharp enough to cut. "I want a husband. I want a partner. I want someone who knows what color the curtains are because they helped hang them, not because they paid the bill. I feel like I'm living with a ghost, Alexander. A ghost who signs checks and sleeps in the bed but isn't really here." The phone rang again. The sound pierced the room, shrill and demanding. Alexander looked at it. The screen lit up with the name of the acquiring company. It was the moment of truth. If he answered, he closed the deal. If he didn't, he risked everything they had worked for. Or so he thought. "Clara, please," he said, his voice pleading now. "Give me 5 minutes. Just let me finish this call, and then we can talk. We can fix this." She shook her head slowly, a sad smile touching her lips. "There's nothing left to fix. You already made your choice. You chose the phone. You chose them." She tightened her grip on the box. "I can't wait for you to find time for me anymore. I deserve to be someone's priority, not an option you fit in between meetings." "Clara, don't do this," he warned, a flash of anger mixing with his desperation. "If you walk out that door, I don't know if we can." "That's just it," she interrupted gently. "You don't know, because you haven't been paying attention. You haven't been looking." She turned the knob. The sound of the latch clicking open was louder than the phone ringing. "I hope you get everything you want, Alexander. I really do. I hope the view from the top is worth the climb. She opened the door. The light from the hallway spilled in, framing her silhouette. She paused for a second, looking back at him. He remembered wanting to run to her, to knock the phone off the hook, to hold her and promise her everything. But his feet were rooted to the floor, paralyzed by the fear of losing the deal, by the fear of failure. He stood still. "Goodbye, Alexander," she whispered. Then she stepped out. The door closed. The click of the latch was final. The phone stopped ringing. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of absence. He remembered standing there for a long time, staring at the closed door, telling himself she would come back. He told himself she was just angry, that she needed space. He told himself he had done the right thing. He had secured their future. But as the weeks turned into months and the months into years, the silence grew louder. The apartment felt emptier. The success came, the money came, the buildings went up, but the warmth never returned. He had traded the woman who knew the color of the curtains for a penthouse where the walls were bare. The memory faded as the car came to a halt. Alexander opened his eyes. The rain was heavier now, drumming against the roof. They were parked in front of the grand hall. Valets were rushing around with umbrellas, shielding guests from the downpour. The building was illuminated, grand and imposing, much like the life he had built since that day. He looked at his hand. It was trembling slightly. He clenched it into a fist to steady it. The guilt was a physical weight in his stomach, heavy and cold. He had told himself for 5 years that he had no choice, that it was business. But sitting there, watching the valet open his door, he knew the truth. He had had a choice. He had chosen wrong. "Sir?" the driver asked, turning slightly in his seat. "We've arrived." Alexander nodded, though the driver couldn't see it well in the dark. "Yes, I see." He reached for the door handle, but hesitated. Through the rain-streaked window, he could see people entering the venue. Women in gowns, men in tuxedos, flashes of cameras. And somewhere in there, Clara was waiting. Not the Clara from the memory, the one who was leaving him, but the Clara who had survived him. The Clara who had built something of her own. The memory of her final words echoed in his mind. "I hope the view from the top is worth the climb." He looked up at the grand hall, then back at the city skyline behind him. It was a view of power. It was a view of success. And it was the loneliest thing he had ever seen. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool air of the car before stepping out into the rain. The valet held the umbrella over him as he stepped onto the wet pavement. The sound of the rain was soothing, masking the noise of the crowd. He walked toward the entrance, his steps measured. He felt exposed, as if everyone could see the regret written on his face. He thought about the box she had been holding. He wondered what was inside. Clothes? Books? Photos? Did she keep the photo from the beach? Or had she thrown that away too? The uncertainty was torture. He had assumed she was struggling, that without his financial backing she would falter. That assumption had been his shield, protecting his ego from the truth of his abandonment. But Marcus had said she was successful. She was being honored. As he approached the doors, the heat from inside spilled out to meet him. The murmur of voices grew louder. He stopped for a moment under the awning, shaking the rain from his coat. He needed a moment to compose himself. He couldn't walk in there looking like a man haunted by ghosts. He had to look like the tycoon they expected. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his cuffs, and put the mask back on. The mask of Alexander Thorne, the man who never loses, the man who never regrets. But beneath the mask, his heart was pounding a different rhythm. He was walking into a room full of people, but he was looking for one. He was walking into a celebration, but he felt like he was attending a funeral for the past. He pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside. The light was bright, the music swelling. He scanned the room, his eyes searching, dreading, and hoping all at once. The memory of the closed door 5 years ago was still fresh, but now he was about to open a new one. And he had no idea what was waiting on the other side. The suspense tightened in his chest, a knot of anxiety that refused to loosen. He took a step forward, into the crowd, into the unknown, carrying the weight of the past main hall. A different kind of quiet prevailed backstage. Here, away from the glittering chandeliers and the clinking of champagne flutes, Clara stood before a vanity mirror, the bright lights framing her reflection. She was adjusting the strap of her gown, a deep emerald silk that flowed like water over her shoulders. It was a color of growth, of renewal, chosen deliberately. Her hands were steady, though her heart beat a rhythm that echoed in her ears. She could hear the muffled sound of the orchestra tuning up, a low hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Her assistant, Sarah, hovered nearby, holding a clipboard. "They're ready for you, Clara. The host is finishing his speech. You're up in 5. Clara nodded, meeting her own eyes in the mirror. She saw the woman she had become, but for a fleeting second, she saw the ghost of the woman she had been 5 years ago. The memory surfaced not as a sharp pain, but as a dull ache, a scar that had healed but never fully faded. She remembered the bathroom of that small apartment, the cold tile beneath her knees. She had been alone then, too. The silence after Alexander's departure had been absolute, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. She had felt hollowed out, as if her chest had been carved open and left empty. It was there, on that cold floor, that she had held the small plastic stick in her trembling hand. 2 lines. The world had stopped spinning. Panic had risen first, a cold tide in her throat. How would she do this alone? How would she tell him? But then the panic had receded, replaced by a fierce, protective heat that started in her belly and spread to her fingertips. She hadn't called him. She had looked at her reflection in the mirror, pale and tear-stained, and made a promise. "You are enough," she had whispered to herself. "We are enough." That promise had become the foundation of everything. The early months of pregnancy had been the hardest. She had worked, until her feet swollen, designing layouts for clients who barely acknowledged her presence. She had saved every penny, skipping meals sometimes to ensure she could afford the prenatal vitamins. There were nights when the loneliness was so heavy it felt physical, when she would sit on the edge of her bed and cry silently so as not to disturb the neighbors, wondering if she had made a mistake. But then she would feel the first flutter of movement, a tiny kick against her palm, and the doubt would vanish. They were her anchors. "Clara?" Sarah's voice brought her back to the present. "You okay?" Clara smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "I'm fine. Just thinking." "About him?" Sarah asked softly, glancing toward the door that led to the main hall. Clara turned away from the mirror. "About us. About how far we've come." She walked over to a small table where a framed photo sat face down. She didn't need to look at it to know what was there. It was a picture of the twins, Leo and Mia, taken last week. They were laughing, covered in paint, their eyes bright with life. They had his eyes, yes, but they had her smile. They were her masterpiece. She remembered the first year of Aura Design. She had operated out of her living room, samples spread across the coffee table, sketches pinned to the walls. She had faced rejection after rejection. Potential clients would ask about her partners, her backing, assuming a woman alone couldn't handle a large project. She had learned to smile through the skepticism, to let her work speak louder than her words. She remembered the night she landed her first major contract. She had come home, exhausted, and woken the twins just to hug them. They had been toddlers then, confused but happy to be held. That night, she had realized that her success wasn't about proving Alexander wrong. It was about proving to her children that their mother was strong. The pain of the abandonment had transformed into fuel. Every late night, every risk taken, every moment of doubt had been burned to keep the fire going. She hadn't built this life to spite him. She had built it to survive him. And in surviving, she had thrived. The glamour of tonight, the award, the applause, it was all just noise. The real victory was the quiet confidence she felt when she looked in the mirror. She didn't need a savior. She had saved herself. 2 minutes, Sarah announced. Clara took a deep breath. She thought about Alexander out there. She wondered if he knew. Did he know about the twins? Did he know that the woman he left struggling was now the one honoring the event? Part of her wanted to hide, to protect the fragile peace they had built. But another part, the part that had stood on that cold bathroom floor 5 years ago, knew she had nothing to hide. She had no shame. Her life was open, honest, and built on truth. She walked to the wings of the stage. The music swelled, the applause growing louder as the host mentioned her name. "A woman who has redefined elegance in our city." The voice boomed. Clara closed her eyes for a second. She thought of the nights she had spent stitching fabrics by hand because she couldn't afford labor. She thought of the mornings she had dragged herself out of bed when she was 8 months pregnant with twins, still answering emails. She thought of the first time Leo called her Mama, and the first time Mia took her first step. These were the moments that mattered. This award was just a symbol. She stepped out from the shadows into the blinding light. The applause washed over her, warm and enveloping. She scanned the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. And there he was, Alexander. He stood near the front, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked on her. For a moment, time seemed to suspend. She saw the shock in his posture, the way his hand tightened around his glass. He looked older, tired. She felt a pang of sympathy, but it didn't weaken her. It only strengthened her resolve. She walked to the microphone, the heels of her shoes clicking confidently on the stage floor. She placed her hands on the podium, feeling the solid wood beneath her palms. She was grounded. She was here. She looked out at the audience, then briefly at him. She didn't look away. She didn't hide. She smiled, not for him, but for herself, for the journey that had brought her to this exact spot. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and steady, amplified across the hall. "When I started my journey, I was told that I was too small, too inexperienced, too alone. But I learned that being alone doesn't mean being weak. It means you have the space to find your own strength." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. She saw Alexander flinch slightly, as if the words were directed solely at him. In a way, they were. But they were also for every woman who had ever been told they couldn't do it without a man beside them. "I built Aura Design not to build a legacy of wealth, but to build a legacy of resilience," she continued, her voice gaining warmth. "For my children. For the future." She didn't mention them explicitly, but she knew Alexander would hear the implication. She saw his eyes widen slightly, a flicker of realization crossing his face. The suspense in the room was palpable. Everyone was listening, but only one person was truly hearing the subtext. Clara finished her speech, accepting the Crystal Award. It was heavy, cold, but she held it like something precious. As she stepped back from the microphone, the applause erupted again. She didn't linger. She turned and walked off the stage, back into the shadows of the wings. Her heart was racing now, the adrenaline spiking. She had faced the room. She had faced him. And she had stood tall. Sarah met her with a glass of water. "You were incredible." Clara took a sip, her hands shaking slightly now that the performance was over. "It's not over," she said quietly. "He's here." He saw them. "The twins?" Sarah asked, lowering her voice. "No," Clara said, looking toward the exit. "Not yet. But he saw me. And he knows something has changed. The real conversation is yet to come." She set the glass down. She felt a mix of fear and anticipation. She had protected her children for 5 years, keeping them from the shadow of his absence. Now the light was shining bright, and shadows were inevitable. But she was no longer the woman on the bathroom floor. She was the woman on the stage, and she was ready for whatever came next. She walked toward the private exit, needing a moment of air before the inevitable encounter. The hallway was quiet, lined with framed photos of past honorees. She stopped at one, seeing her own name now added to the plaque. It was real. Her life was real. Alexander was a memory, a part of her past, but not her future. Unless he changed. Unless he proved he was more than the man who chose the phone over the goodbye. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. The image of the twins waiting at home with the nanny gave her strength. They were asleep now, dreaming innocent dreams. She had to protect that, but she also had to be honest. If Alexander wanted in, he would have to go through her. And she was no longer easy to bypass. She pushed off the wall, straightening her spine. The night was young, and the story was far from finished. She walked forward, into the dimly lit roar of the applause that still echoed in her ears. The air here was cooler, smelling faintly of fresh paint and polished wood. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking a steady rhythm against the floor, but her mind was a whirlwind. She could feel the weight of the Crystal Award in her hand, cold and solid, a tangible proof of years of invisible labor. She knew she should head to the after-party, to mingle with the donors and smile for the cameras, but she needed a moment. She needed to breathe. Behind her, the shadows shifted. Alexander had followed. He hadn't planned to. His feet had moved before his mind could command them to stop. He watched the sway of her emerald gown, the way she held herself with a confidence that was entirely new to him. The Clara he remembered had often made herself small, trying to fit into the spaces he left empty. This woman occupied the space around her. She commanded it. He quickened his pace, the sound of his own shoes merging with hers until he was close enough to speak. "Clara," he said. His voice sounded rough in the quiet hallway, unfamiliar even to his own ears. She stopped. She didn't turn immediately. For a heartbeat, she stood still, her back to him, and he saw the slight rise and fall of her shoulders as she took a breath. Then she turned. The light from a sconce on the wall caught her face, highlighting the sharp line of her jaw, the calm depth of her eyes. There was no shock in her expression, only a guarded readiness. "Alexander," she said. Her voice was steady, devoid of the tremor he had feared, or perhaps hoped for. "I wondered if you would come find me." "I had to," he admitted, stepping closer but stopping when he saw her eyes narrow slightly. He respected the boundary, planting his feet where he stood. "I had to see you. After the speech, after seeing you up there." He gestured vaguely back toward the main hall. "You've changed. People change, Alexander. 5 years is a long time." She shifted the award to her other hand, her movement fluid. "Especially when you spend them building something from nothing." He flinched at the words. From nothing. It was a direct reference to the life he had left her with. Or the life he thought he had left her with. "Marcus told me you were doing well," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral, but the curiosity bled through. "But seeing it, hearing them talk about you as the primary sponsor, I didn't expect this." "What did you expect?" she asked. The question wasn't aggressive, but it was sharp, cutting through the polite veneer. "Did you expect me to be struggling? Did you think I'd be waiting for you to come back and save me?" Alexander looked down at his hands. He wanted to lie. He wanted to say no, that he always believed in her. But the truth was a heavy stone in his throat. I thought you'd need help. I left you with nothing, Clara. No backing, no connections. I assumed." He trailed off, the assumption tasting bitter on his tongue. "I assumed you'd resent me. I assumed you'd be angry." "I was angry," Clara said softly. She took a step toward him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of the pain she had buried. "For a long time, I was furious. I hated you for choosing the phone. I hated you for making me feel like I was less important than a contract." She paused, her gaze locking onto his. "But hate is heavy, Alexander. It weighs you down. I couldn't carry that and build a life at the same time. So I let it go. Not for you. For me." The honesty of it struck him like a physical blow. He had expected bitterness, perhaps a demand for restitution, or even tears. He hadn't expected this serene indifference. It was worse than anger. Anger implied she still cared about what he had done. This was acceptance. She had moved on. He was the one stuck in the past. "You look," he started, searching for the right word. "You look radiant. Successful. You look like you never needed me at all." "I didn't," she said simply. There was no malice in the words, just fact. "It was hard. There were nights I didn't know how I'd pay rent. There were days I cried until I fell asleep. But I did it. And because I did it, I know what I'm worth. I know what I can survive." Alexander felt a profound sense of loss wash over him. It wasn't just the loss of her. It was the loss of the narrative he had constructed to protect himself. He had told himself for 5 years that his sacrifice was necessary, that she was better off without his distractions, or that she would eventually understand the magnitude of what he was building for them. But standing here, seeing the woman she had become without him, he realized the truth. She was better off because she was free of him. "I'm glad," he said, and he meant it, though the words burned. "I'm genuinely glad, Clara. You deserve this. You always deserved more than I gave you." Clara studied him for a long moment. The silence between them was filled with the ghost of the life they could have had. She saw the gray in his hair, the lines of stress around his eyes that money couldn't erase. He looked powerful, yes, but he also looked lonely. She remembered the penthouse he used to talk about, the one he was building in his mind. She wondered if he was living in it now, and if it was as empty as she feared. "Thank you," she said finally. "That means something, hearing you say that." "Does it?" he asked, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. "Does anything I say matter anymore? Or am I just a stranger in a hallway?" "You're not a stranger," Clara replied. "You're part of my history, but you're not part of my future. Not unless things change. Drastically." The implication hung in the air. Alexander felt a spark of hope, dangerous and fragile. How would things change? "That's not for tonight," she said, checking the watch on her wrist. A subtle signal that the conversation was over. "Tonight is about the work, about the charity, about the people we're helping." She shifted the award again. "I have to go back in. There are people waiting." "Clara, wait," he said, reaching out a hand but stopping before he touched her. "Will I see you again? Not here. Not at an event. Just you." She looked at his hand, then up to his eyes. "I don't know, Alexander. You left once. You chose your work over us. Why should I believe you'd choose differently now?" "Because I know what I lost," he said, his voice low, intense. I know what the view looks like now. And it's empty. Clara's expression softened, just for a fraction of a second. She saw the sincerity there, the crack in the armor of the tycoon. But she had learned hard lessons. Trust wasn't given on words alone. Then prove it, she said quietly. Actions, Alexander. Not words. Words are easy. You were always good with words. She turned then, before he could respond, before she could see the effect her words had on him. She walked away down the corridor, her steps steady, not looking back. Alexander stood alone in the hallway, the silence rushing back in to fill the space she had occupied. He watched her until she turned the corner and disappeared from sight. He leaned against the wall, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The encounter had not gone as he imagined. He had expected to be the hero, the one who returned to fix things. Instead, he was the supplicant, asking for a chance to be considered. It was humbling. It was painful. But it was also real. For the first time in 5 years, he was seeing Clara not as a memory or a regret, but as a person. A strong, independent person who had survived his absence. He pushed off the wall and straightened his jacket. The gala continued beyond the doors, full of noise and celebration, but he felt detached from it. His mind was racing. Actions, not words. He repeated the phrase to himself. He had to show her. But how? He couldn't just buy her affection. She had proven she didn't need his money. He couldn't just promise her time. He had broken that promise before. He began to walk back toward the main hall, but his pace was slower now. He passed a mirror on the wall and paused, looking at his reflection. He looked the same as he had when he entered, but he felt different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate need to understand the life she had built. He wondered again about the details Marcus had mentioned. Aura design. Primary sponsor. There were rumors too, whispers he hadn't paid attention to until now. Rumors about her life outside of work. He resumed walking, his mind turning over the possibilities. He needed to know more. He needed to understand the full scope of the world she had created without him. As he approached the doors to the ballroom, the noise grew louder, but his focus was singular. He had found her. He had spoken to her. But the story wasn't over. In fact, he sensed that the most important part was yet to come. There were things she hadn't said, secrets held behind those calm eyes. He could feel it. The way she had protected her personal life, the way she spoke of us, in the past tense but hinted at a conditional future. He pushed the doors open and stepped back into the light. The crowd parted for him, eyes turning, whispers starting. He ignored them. He scanned the room, not for investors or partners, but for clues. He walked toward the table, where Clara had been seated earlier. It was empty now, but there were items left behind. A program, a napkin, and there, slightly tucked under the table setting, a photograph that must have fallen from her purse. He glanced around to ensure no one was watching, then picked it up. His heart stopped. It was a candid shot, taken in a park. Clara was sitting on a bench, laughing. But she wasn't alone. Beside her were 2 children, a boy and a girl. They looked about 5 years old. They had her smile. But as Alexander stared at the photo, the blood drained from his face. They had his eyes. The shape of their faces, the curve of their brows, it was unmistakable. The noise of the gala faded into a dull roar. The room spun slightly. The photo trembled in his hand. Twins. She had twins. 5 years ago. The timeline matched perfectly. The abandonment, the silence, the sudden success, it all shifted into a new, terrifying perspective. She hadn't just built a business. She had built a family he knew nothing about, a family he had abandoned before he even knew they existed. He slipped the photo into his jacket pocket, his fingers gripping it tightly. The encounter in the hallway suddenly made sense. Her protectiveness, her warning. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was protecting them. The suspense that had been building in his chest tightened into a knot of panic and overwhelming wonder. He looked toward the exit where she had disappeared. He thought he had found closure in the hallway, but he had only found the first page of a new chapter. And this chapter involved lives that were half his own. He turned away from the table, his mind racing with questions. How had she kept this secret? Why? Did she hate him that much? Or was she afraid of what he would do? The tycoon who commanded boardrooms felt powerless. He had discovered her success, but this was something else entirely. This was legacy. This was blood. He walked toward the exit, ignoring the calls of his name from the crowd. He needed air. He needed to think. He needed to find her again. But not as a business partner. Not as an ex-husband. As a father who had just woken up to the reality that he was no longer alone in the world. The rain was still falling outside, but he didn't care. He stepped out into the night, the photo burning against his chest, the image of those two faces haunting his every thought. The shielded just enough to keep the photograph dry. He held it with both hands, his thumbs trembling against the glossy surface. The streetlight above flickered, casting a wavering glow on the image. He looked at the boy first. The child was sitting on a swing, his head thrown back in laughter. The shape of his jaw, the set of his eyebrows, it was like looking at a miniature version of himself from 30 years ago. Then he looked at the girl. She was holding a doll, her eyes wide and serious, staring directly into the camera lens. They were his eyes. The specific shade of hazel, flecked with green, a trait unique to his family line. There was no denying it. There was no scientific test needed to confirm what his instinct screamed was true. His breath hitched in his throat, a sharp, painful sound lost in the drumming of the rain. 5 years. The math was brutal in its simplicity. If they were 5 now, Clara had been pregnant when she left. She had known. She had walked out of that apartment, carrying a box of her belongings and the secret of his children, and she had never told him. The betrayal stung, hot and sharp, but it was immediately eclipsed by a wave of guilt so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. He had not been there. He had not known. He had missed first steps, first words, first birthdays. He had missed everything. "Sir?" The voice startled him. He quickly slipped the photo into his inner jacket pocket, pressing it against his heart. He turned to see the valet standing nearby, holding an umbrella, looking concerned. "Your car is ready, Mr. Thorne. Shall I bring it around?" Alexander blinked, the rain dripping from his lashes. "No," he said, his voice raspy. "Wait. Keep it there. I'm not leaving yet." The valet hesitated, then nodded. "Very good, sir." He stepped back into the shadows, giving Alexander space. He needed to see them. The photo was evidence, but he needed reality. He needed to know they were real, that this wasn't some cruel trick of light and memory. He moved deeper into the shadows of the alleyway beside the exit, positioning himself where he could see the driveway without being seen. He told himself it was intrusive, that he should respect her privacy, but the pull was magnetic. He was a man who controlled markets and moved millions with a phone call. But now he was hiding in the rain like a trespasser in his own life. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The cold seeped into his bones, but he didn't feel it. His entire being was focused on the door. Finally, it opened. Clara stepped out. She was no longer wearing her shawl. She had wrapped a coat tightly around herself. But she wasn't alone. Alexander's hand gripped the wet brick of the wall to steady himself. Holding her hands were 2 small figures. They were bundled in matching raincoats, yellow bright against the dark night. The twins. Seeing them in the flesh was different from the photo. They moved with energy, skipping slightly despite the wet pavement. The boy said something, pointing at a puddle, and Clara laughed. It was a sound Alexander hadn't heard in 5 years, a genuine, unburdened laugh that seemed to light up the dark driveway. "Careful, Leo," Clara said, her voice carrying softly over the rain. "Don't splash Mia." "I won't," the boy Leo protested happily. He jumped over the puddle, landing with a squelch. The girl Mia giggled. "You got wet, Leo." "It's water, Mia." "It's supposed to be wet," Leo argued, sounding so much like Alexander used to sound when he was arguing logic during board meetings that it made his chest ache. Clara stopped near the curb, waiting for the car. She knelt down to adjust Leo's hood. Her movements were tender, practiced. She wiped a smudge of dirt from Mia's cheek. Alexander watched the interaction, mesmerized. He saw the way she looked at them. It was a look of total devotion, a love so fierce it created a barrier around the 3 of them. He realized then that he was the outsider. He was looking in through a window of glass that he had shattered himself. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out to open the door. Clara stood up, taking both children's hands again. "Come on, loves. Time to go home. Nanny is waiting." "Can we read a story?" Mia asked, climbing into the seat. 2 stories, Clara negotiated, buckling her in. "But then sleep. No arguing." "No arguing," Leo repeated, climbing in after his sister. Alexander memorized the sound of their voices. He memorized the way Mia tucked her hair behind her ear, a gesture Clara used to make. He memorized the way Leo stood with his feet apart, a stance Alexander recognized from his own mirror. They were a blend of both of them, a living testament to a union he had tried to erase. As the car door closed, separating them from the night air, Clara paused. She looked around, her eyes scanning the shadows near the alley. For a terrifying second, Alexander thought she saw him. He held his breath, shrinking back against the brick. But her gaze passed over him, seeing only the darkness. She got into the front seat, and the SUV pulled away, taillights fading into the rainy blur of the city. Alexander stood alone in the driveway. The valet approached cautiously again. "Sir? Your car?" "Yes," Alexander whispered. He walked toward the town car, his legs feeling like lead. He slid into the back seat, the leather cold against his suit. The driver closed the door, sealing him in silence once more. "Home, Mr. Thorne?" the driver asked. Alexander leaned his head back against the seat. He closed his eyes, but the image of the yellow raincoats was burned into his eyelids. "Home," he said. But he knew it wasn't home. The penthouse was just a building. Home was in that SUV, driving away into the night. He pulled the photograph out again. The light from the passing street lamps illuminated the faces of his children. Leo and Mia. He had names for them now. They weren't just concepts anymore, they were people. They had personalities, voices, preferences. They liked stories. They liked puddles. They existed independently of him. And yet they were part of him. The anger he had felt initially began to dissolve, replaced by a crushing sorrow. Why had she kept them from him? Was it revenge? Or was it protection? He remembered the way Clara had spoken in the hallway. "I let it go. Not for you. For me." She had protected her peace. She had protected her children from a father who chose work over family. She had decided he wasn't safe for them. The realization was humiliating, but it was also a call to action. He looked at the photo again. "I'm here now," he whispered to the images. "I know now." The car turned toward the highway, heading uptown. Alexander tapped the partition glass. "Driver," he said. "Yes, sir?" "Change of plans. Don't go to the penthouse. Take me to the office." "The office, sir? It's late." "I know. Just go." He needed space. He needed to think. The penthouse was too quiet, too full of echoes. The office was neutral ground. As the car accelerated, Alexander opened his phone. He scrolled to Marcus's number. He hesitated. He couldn't just ask Marcus to investigate her. That felt like an invasion. But he needed to know. He needed to know everything. Where they lived, what they liked, who their doctors were. He needed to know the life he had missed. He typed a message instead of calling. "Marcus, I need information. Discreet. About Clara. And her family. Do not alert anyone. Just facts." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. He put the phone down on the seat beside him. He looked out the window. The city was a blur of lights, but his focus was internal. He thought about the next day. He couldn't just storm into her life. She had warned him. Actions, Alexander. Not words. If he pushed too hard, she would shut him out completely. She had proven she could survive without him. She would protect those children at all costs. He had to be smart. He had to be patient. He had to be the father they needed, not the tycoon they feared. The car slowed for a traffic light. Alexander caught his reflection in the window. He looked haggard, undone. But there was something else in his eyes now. A purpose. For 5 years, his drive had been about accumulation. More money, more buildings, more power. Now, for the first time, his drive was about connection. He wanted to know the weight of Leo's hand in his. He wanted to hear Mia ask him a question. He wanted to earn the right to be called Dad. The light turned green. The car moved forward. Alexander tucked the photo back into his pocket, close to his skin. He wouldn't let go of this. He wouldn't let another moment slip by. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean but inside. The storm was just beginning. He had discovered the truth, but the journey to against the stormy sky. Only a few lights burned in the upper floors, solitary stars in a concrete constellation. Alexander told the driver to wait. He needed the office. The penthouse was too filled with memories of emptiness, but the office was a place of action. Here, problems were solved. Here, strategies were formed. But as he stepped into the lobby, the security guard's surprised expression reminded him that even here, he was an intruder in his own life at this hour. "Mr. Thorne," the guard stammered, rising from his desk. "We weren't expecting." "Open the executive lift, James," Alexander said quietly. He didn't have the energy for explanations. He just needed to be somewhere where the silence felt purposeful. The ascent was smooth, silent. When the doors opened on the top floor, the vast expanse of the headquarters was dark. The city lights poured in through the windows, casting long, geometric shadows across the carpet. Alexander walked to his office, flicking on a single desk lamp. The pool of warm light illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. He sat in his leather chair, the one he had spent thousands of hours in, and placed the photograph on the desk. Leo and Mia stared back at him, frozen in a moment of joy he hadn't shared. He poured himself a glass of water, not whiskey. He needed clarity. He checked his phone. No response from Marcus yet. The waiting was agonizing. Every minute felt like an hour. He traced the edge of the photo. She did this alone, he thought. She raised them alone. The weight of that fact pressed down on his chest. He had assumed she would struggle. He had assumed she would need his money. It was an arrogance he hadn't even realized he carried until tonight. An hour later, the soft chime of the elevator announced a visitor. Marcus stepped into the office, holding a thin manila folder. He looked tired, his tie loosened, but his expression was serious. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the rest of the dark office. "You called," Marcus said, placing the folder on the desk. He didn't sit. "I pulled what I could without triggering alerts. Financials, public records, business registrations." Alexander looked at the folder as if it were made of glass. And it's not what you think," Marcus said softly. He opened the folder, spreading out the papers. "Clara's company, Aura Design. It's not just surviving, Alexander. It's thriving. Revenue has doubled every year for the last 3. She has contracts with hotels, corporate offices, even some government projects. She's fully solvent, highly profitable." Alexander scanned the documents. The numbers were impressive, better than some of his own subsidiary projects. "She didn't take anything from me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Nothing," Marcus confirmed. "No alimony claims. No modifications to the prenup. She never filed for support. She built this entirely on her own credit, her own reputation." Marcus paused, leaning slightly on the desk. "There's no record of a husband either. No marriage license, no joint accounts, no secondary income source. Just her. And the children." Alexander leaned back, the leather creaking under his weight. He felt a strange mixture of pride and devastation. Pride that the woman he once loved was so capable, so strong. Devastation that she had had to be. "She never asked," he whispered. "All those years. I thought she was suffering. I told myself I was doing this for the family, that my success would protect them. But she protected them. Without me. She didn't want your help," Marcus said, his tone gentle but firm. "Or maybe she knew you wouldn't give it. Not really. Not without conditions." Alexander stood up and walked to the window. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the city was still wet, reflecting the lights like a mirror. "I thought I was the provider," he said, more to the glass than to Marcus. "I thought money was the only way to love someone, to keep them safe." He turned back to the desk. "But she didn't need my money. She needed my presence. And I wasn't there." He picked up the photo again. "She kept them from me," he said, the pain returning. "Why, Marcus? If she's so strong, why hide them? Was it punishment?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't think so. Look at the school records I found. Private schooling, excellent care. She protected them from scrutiny. If she had announced they were yours 5 years ago, the press would have hounded them. They would have been the tycoon's abandoned kids. By keeping you out of it, she gave them a normal life. She protected their privacy." Alexander nodded slowly. It made sense. Clara had always been fierce about privacy. She had hated the spotlight even when they were together. She had shielded them from the chaos of his world. But in doing so, she had shielded him from them. "So I'm a stranger," he said. "To my own children." "You can change that," Marcus said. "But not with this." He tapped the financial reports. "You can't buy your way into this, Alexander. She proved she doesn't need your money. If you try to throw cash at her, she'll shut you out completely. She'll see it as you trying to control the narrative again." "Then what do I do?" Alexander asked, feeling helpless for the first time in his life. "How do I fix 5 years of absence?" "You start small," Marcus advised. "You respect her boundaries. You show up, not as Alexander Thorne, the billionaire, but as a father. If she lets you." Alexander looked. Down at the desk. The papers detailing Clara's success were stark evidence of his own failure as a husband. She had climbed the mountain he thought only he could climb. She had done it while carrying the weight of 2 children. He had struggled to carry the weight of one company. "I need to know them," Alexander said, his voice gaining strength. "Not through papers. Not through spies. I need to know them. Then you have to talk to her, Marcus said. Tomorrow. But be careful. She's not the same woman who walked out of that apartment. She's harder now. Stronger. And she has everything to lose if you disrupt their stability. Alexander gathered the papers and put them back in the folder. He placed the photo on top of them. I won't disrupt them, he promised. I'll integrate. I'll find a way to be part of the structure she built, without tearing it down. He walked around the desk and stopped in front of Marcus. Thank you, Marcus. For this. For not judging me. I've worked for you for 20 years, Marcus said, a faint smile touching his lips. I've seen you at your best and your worst. But tonight you look like you finally see what matters. Alexander nodded. He picked up the folder and the photo. I'm going home. Not to the penthouse. To the house in the Hamptons. It's quieter there. I need to think. Good idea, Marcus said. Get some sleep, Alexander. You'll need it. Alexander walked out of the office, leaving the lights on. He didn't mind the waste. The darkness felt too heavy tonight. As he rode the elevator down, he looked at the photo one more time. Leo and Mia. They were real. They were safe. They were loved. Clara had ensured that. Now it was his turn to ensure he deserved to be in that picture. The investigation was over. The facts were clear. Clara didn't need a savior. She needed a partner. And if he wanted to be a father, he had to learn how to be a partner first. The car was waiting. The rain had stopped. The air was clean. Alexander stepped out into the night, the folder under his arm, the photo in his pocket. He had a plan. It wasn't a business strategy. It was a life strategy. And for the first time, he was ready to execute it with his heart, not his wallet. Compared to the urgency pounding in his chest. He had the facts now. He had the proof. But facts on paper were cold. They didn't tell him how to look his children in the eye. They didn't tell him how to face the woman who had kept them safe from him. The town car pulled up to the service entrance of the venue. The gala was over, the guests gone, but the cleanup crews were still bustling. Cases of champagne were being loaded onto trucks. Flowers were being stripped from the tables, petals scattered across the wet pavement like confetti from a party that had ended too soon. The magic of the night had evaporated, leaving only the stark reality of the morning after. It felt appropriate. The illusions were gone. Now there was only truth. He showed his credentials to the security guard, who looked surprised to see him returning at 4 a.m., his face pale under the fluorescent lights of the loading dock. Mr. Thorne? We thought everyone had left. The event concluded hours ago. I need to see Miss Clara, Alexander said, his voice leaving no room for argument, though it lacked its usual command. It was softer, frayed at the edges. She's still here. I know she is. She oversees the breakdown. The guard hesitated, checking his clipboard, then radioed upstairs. The static crackle was the only sound in the vast, empty lobby. A moment later, he nodded, handing Alexander a temporary pass. She's in the green room, packing up her personal items. She said you can go up, but she said not to take long. She has an early flight. Alexander took the service elevator up. The mirrors inside were smudged with fingerprints, the gold trim tarnished. He looked at his reflection. He looked haggard. His suit was wrinkled from the rain and the long night, his tie loosened and askew. He didn't fix it. He didn't try to look the part of the tycoon. He wanted her to see the man beneath the title. The man who was afraid. The elevator dinged, a sharp sound in the quiet shaft. He walked down the quiet hallway to the green room. The carpet here was plush, muffling his footsteps. The door was ajar, light spilling out into the corridor. Inside, Clara was folding a garment bag. She was no longer wearing the emerald gown. She was in simple jeans and a cashmere sweater, her hair tied back in a loose knot that had begun to unravel. She looked tired, the adrenaline of the event finally wearing off, leaving her vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. She didn't look up when he entered, but her hands paused on the zipper. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the dust motes dancing in the light. I wondered if you'd come back, she said, her voice calm but edged with fatigue. She didn't turn around. Most men would have gone home to sleep, or to celebrate their success. You look like you haven't slept in a week. I'm not most men, Alexander replied, stepping into the room but staying near the door. He didn't want to crowd her. He respected the space she occupied. And I'm not here to celebrate. I'm here because I can't sleep. I can't breathe knowing that I walked away from them tonight. Knowing I walked away 5 years ago. Clara turned then. She leaned against the table, crossing her arms. It was a defensive posture, a shield built over years of solitude, but her eyes were clear. There were no tears, only a steely resolve. "You saw the photo," she stated. It wasn't a question. She knew he had seen it. She had seen him looking at it in the driveway. "I did," Alexander said. He reached into his jacket and pulled it out. He held it gently, like it was made of glass, like it might shatter if he gripped too hard. "Leo and Mia. They're incredible, Clara. They look just like..." He couldn't finish the sentence. The emotion choked him, tightening his throat. He looked at the boy's laugh, the girl's serious eyes. They were his legacy, and he had been absent for every chapter. "They look like themselves," Clara corrected softly, pushing off the table to walk past him. She stopped by the window, looking out at the loading dock below where the trucks were reversing. "They're their own people. Not extensions of you. Not extensions of me. Just them. And they deserve to stay that way." Alexander lowered the photo, clutching it to his chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question had been burning in his throat since the driveway, a coal that refused to cool. 5 years, Clara. 5 years I could have been there. I could have helped. I could have been a father. Helped. Clara's voice sharpened slightly, turning to face him. The fatigue was still there, but beneath it was a spark of anger, old and preserved. "With what? Your money? Your name? Alexander, when I left, you made it very clear that your work was your priority. You chose the merger over me. You chose the phone over the goodbye. If I had told you I was pregnant, what would you have done? Would you have put down the phone? Or would you have tried to buy a nanny and put me on a payroll?" She walked back toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. "I knew you. I loved you, but I knew you. You would have tried to fix it with a check. You would have tried to solve parenthood like a business problem. And I couldn't raise my children in a house where their father was a visitor who paid the bills. I wanted them to know love, not liquidity. I wanted them to know presence, not presence." Alexander flinched. Every word was a truth he had been avoiding, a mirror held up to his soul. "I was wrong," he admitted. The words felt heavy, rough like gravel, but necessary. "I was blind. I thought success was the only way to protect a family. I thought if I built enough walls, nothing could hurt us. I see now that I was wrong. The walls kept me out, not the danger. But that doesn't change the fact that they are my children. And I want to know them. I need to know them." Clara studied him. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of composure she had perfected over years of board meetings and single parenthood. "Wanting isn't enough, Alexander. Desire is cheap. Commitment is expensive. You abandoned us before they were even born. You don't get to walk back in because you saw a picture and felt a pang of guilt. Guilt doesn't raise children. Consistency does. They are stable. They are happy. They have a routine. You are a variable I cannot control. And I do not allow variables in their lives." "I don't want to control them," Alexander said, stepping closer, his voice pleading, stripped of all arrogance. "I want to be part of their routine. I want to be the dad who reads the stories. The dad who checks the homework. The dad who teaches them how to ride a bike. I don't care about the money. I don't care about the legacy. I need a chance. Please." Clara sighed, rubbing her temples. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw the break in his armor. He wasn't the untouchable magnate anymore. He was a father who had realized what he lost. He was a man standing in the wreckage of his own making, asking for a shovel to help clean it up. "If I let you in," she said slowly, weighing every word, "it has to be on my terms. No press. No paparazzi. No using them for PR. They are not accessories to your legacy. They are not photo ops." "Agreed," Alexander said immediately. "Whatever you need. Private schools, private doctors, private everything. I'll sign whatever legal documents you want. Non-disclosures. Trusts in their name that I can't touch. I don't want credit. I just want access." "It's not about the legalities," Clara said, walking over to him. She stopped just out of arm's reach. The distance between them felt like miles. "It's about consistency. If you start this, you cannot stop. You cannot miss a birthday because of a board meeting. You cannot cancel a visit because of a flight delay. If you walk away again, Alexander, if you break their hearts because you got busy, I will make sure you never see them again. I will use every resource I have to keep you away. I mean that." The threat hung in the air, cold and serious. It wasn't a bluff. Alexander nodded, accepting the weight of it. "I understand. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve that yet. I'm asking for an opportunity to prove I've changed. To prove I can be who they need. Clara studied him for a long moment. The silence stretched, filled with the distant sound of trucks backing up outside, the beep 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 of reversing engines counting down the seconds. Finally, she nodded once. It was a small movement, but it felt monumental. Next Saturday. Noon. My house. I'll send you the address. Don't be late. And don't bring gifts. They don't need things. They need you. Just bring yourself. Alexander felt a surge of relief, so strong his knees nearly buckled. He had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. Thank you, he whispered. Clara, thank you. You won't regret this. Don't thank me yet, she said, turning back to her bag, zipping it shut with a decisive sound. Saturday is a long way away. A lot can happen in a week. And you have a lot of making up to do. 5 years of birthdays, 5 years of Christmases. You can't fix that in an afternoon. He stood there for a moment, watching her pack. He wanted to hug her, to touch her hand, to bridge the gap, but he respected the boundary she had drawn. He had crossed too many lines already. He needed to earn the right to cross the new ones. I'll be there, he promised. I won't let you down. Not this time. He turned and walked to the door. At the threshold, he paused, his hand on the frame. He needed to show her he was paying attention. They like pudding, he said, remembering the photo, the way the boy's mouth was stained, the way the girl held her spoon. Leo likes chocolate. I saw it on his face. Clara stopped packing. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders softened slightly, the tension draining just a fraction. Strawberry, she corrected quietly. Mia likes strawberry. Leo likes chocolate, but only if it's dark. Milk chocolate makes him sick. Dark chocolate and strawberry, Alexander repeated, committing it to memory, etching it into his mind. I'll remember. I'll bring the right kind. I know you will, she said, her voice barely audible. Because if you don't, I'll know you're not listening. He walked out into the hallway. The air was cooler here, smelling of dust and old carpet, the scent of a party long finished. He walked to the elevator, pressing the button. As he waited, he looked at the photo again. The faces of his children smiled back, unaware of the storm they had caused, unaware of the promise their father had just made. Next Saturday. He had a week to prepare. A week to figure out how to be a father. A week to transform from a tycoon into a dad. The elevator arrived. He stepped inside. The doors closed, sealing him in the small box. He leaned against the back wall, closing his eyes. The confrontation was over. He hadn't won everything. He hadn't gotten instant forgiveness. He hadn't gotten a reunion. But he had gotten a door opening. And for a man who had lived in a closed room for 5 years, that was enough. For now. The car was waiting. The sun was rising over the city, casting long shadows through the lobby. The city was waking up. And Alexander Thorne was finally waking up with it. He stepped out into the morning light, the photo in his pocket, the taste of strawberry and car. The air felt stagnant, heavy with the weight of revelations. Alexander held the photograph in his lap, his thumb tracing the outline of Leo's smile. He had won the meeting. He had secured the chance to see them. But as the adrenaline of the confrontation faded, a colder, more complex emotion began to settle in his gut. It wasn't just relief. It was a bruising of his ego, sharp and unexpected. He looked out the window at the passing buildings. Several of them bore his name. Thorne Tower. Thorne Plaza. He had built these monuments to his own importance, believing that his value was tied to his ability to provide, to protect, to dominate the landscape. But Marcus's report lay on the seat beside him. Clara's success was not a fluke. She had built an empire of her own, brick by brick, while he was busy building his. She hadn't needed his money. She hadn't needed his name. She had needed him, and he hadn't been there. And yet, she had succeeded anyway. The thought stung. It was a vanity he hadn't admitted to himself until now. He had wanted to be the hero of her story. He had wanted to be the one who swooped in to save the day, to show her that leaving him was a mistake because she couldn't make it without him. But she had made it. She had thrived. He was not the savior. He was the absentee. The realization made his chest tighten, a mix of shame and a strange, bitter resentment. Why hadn't she needed him? If she had struggled, if she had called him, he could have fixed it. He could have been the provider. But her independence was a wall he couldn't climb with money. It stripped him of his primary tool. He was a tycoon without a currency that mattered here. The car pulled into the private underground garage of his office building. The engine cut off, leaving a silence that rang in his ears. Alexander didn't move immediately. He sat in the dim light of the garage, staring at the steering wheel. "How do I fit into a life that works perfectly without me?" he asked the empty car. His voice sounded hollow. He was used to being the essential component, the keystone. Now he was an optional accessory. He grabbed the folder of financial reports and the photo, stepping out into the cool concrete space. The elevator ride to the top floor was swift. When he entered his office, the morning light was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes. It looked like a stage set for a play he no longer wanted to act in. He walked to his desk and dropped the folder. It landed with a heavy thud. He sat in his chair, the leather creaking, and picked up his pen. He had a contract to sign on his desk, a merger worth millions. It was the kind of deal he would have killed for a week ago. He uncapped the pen. The ink flowed onto the paper. But his hand stopped. He looked at the signature line. Alexander Thorne. The name felt like a label on a box he wanted to throw away. What did the signature mean? More money? More buildings? More emptiness? He thought of Leo's laugh in the driveway. He thought of Mia's serious eyes. They didn't care about this merger. They didn't care about Thorne Industries. They cared about who showed up on Saturday. He dropped the pen. It rolled across the desk, falling to the floor with a clatter. He leaned back, rubbing his face with both hands. The pride was still there, whispering to him. You are Alexander Thorne. You don't beg. You don't plead. You command. But the regret was louder. You commanded a room full of strangers while your children grew up without knowing your voice. The conflict tore at him. He wanted to be angry at Clara for hiding them, for making him look foolish by succeeding without him. It would be easier to be angry. Anger was a shield. But every time he looked at the photo, the anger dissolved into a sorrow so deep it felt like drowning. His phone buzzed on the desk. The screen lit up. Marcus. He answered, putting it on speaker. Alexander, Marcus said. I heard you went back to the venue. Did you speak to her? I did, Alexander said, his voice tired. She agreed. Next Saturday. Noon. That's good, Marcus said, sounding relieved. That's a start. I have the team ready to draft the non-disclosure agreements you asked for. We can have them over to her lawyers by noon. No, Alexander said sharply. Then he softened. No legal battles, Marcus. Not yet. She doesn't want lawyers. She wants me. Just me. Are you sure? Marcus asked. Protecting your assets is standard procedure. My assets are sitting in a house I haven't seen, Alexander replied, looking at the photo. I don't care about the assets. I care about the access. There was a pause on the line. Marcus knew his boss better than anyone. He knew this tone. It was the sound of a man surrendering, not in defeat, but in realization. Alexander, Marcus said cautiously. You sound different. Is everything okay? No, Alexander admitted. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city he thought he owned. I thought I was the one who built everything, Marcus. I thought I was the foundation. But I looked at her numbers. She's doing better than half my subsidiaries. She did it alone, with 2 kids. He swallowed hard, the pride warring with the humility. It makes me feel small. I wanted to be the one who saved her. But she saved herself. And she saved them. Where does that leave me? It leaves you with a choice, Marcus said gently. You can let that hurt your pride, or you can let it teach you humility. She doesn't need a provider, Alexander. She needs a partner. The kids don't need a tycoon. They need a dad. You can't buy that role. You have to earn it. And earning it means swallowing the pride. Alexander closed his eyes. The truth of it landed like a physical weight. I don't know how to be humble, Marcus. I've spent 20 years being the loudest voice in the room. Then start by being the quietest, Marcus advised. Listen more than you speak. Show up without expecting applause. It's going to be hard. You're going to want to fix things with money. Don't. Just be there. Alexander looked at his reflection in the glass. He saw the lines of stress, the gray hair. He saw a man who had won the world and lost his soul. I'm scared, he whispered, the admission slipping out before he could stop it. What if I go there and they don't like me? What if I'm just a stranger to them? A rich stranger who shows up once in a while. Then you go again, Marcus said firmly. And again, until you're not a stranger. Consistency, Alexander. That's the only currency Clara accepts. Alexander hung up the phone. He placed it face down on the desk. He picked up the photo again. Leo and Mia. They were looking at the camera, unaware of the internal war their father was fighting. He realized then that his pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. It was a burden. If he held on to the need to be the hero, the provider, the dominant force, he would lose them. He had to be willing to be secondary. He had to be willing to be just Dad, not Mr. Thorne. He walked over to the whiteboard on the wall, where strategies and projections were mapped out in colorful markers. He picked up an eraser. Slowly, deliberately, he wiped the board clean. The numbers vanished. The projections disappeared. The white surface was blank. He stared at it. He needed a new strategy. Not for business. For life. He picked up a black marker. He wrote Saturday in the center of the board. Underneath, he wrote listen. Below that, no gifts. Below that, just be there. He stepped back. It was a simple plan. Simpler than any merger he had ever orchestrated. But it felt harder. It required vulnerability. It required him to strip away the armor of the tycoon and stand naked in his failures. He walked back to his desk and sat down. He picked up the pen he had dropped earlier. He looked at the merger contract. He signed it. It was done. The money would come. The buildings would go up. But it didn't matter. It was just noise. He filed the contract away in a drawer, out of sight. He placed the photo of the twins in the center of the desk, where the phone usually sat. Okay, he said to the room. Okay. He took a deep breath. The struggle wasn't over. The pride would flare up again. He knew himself. He was stubborn. He was used to winning. But looking at Mia's eyes, he knew what losing looked like. Losing was missing another birthday. Losing was being a footnote in their lives. He wouldn't allow it. He stood up and grabbed his jacket. He wasn't staying here. The office was a tomb of his old priorities. He needed to prepare. He needed to think about what a 5-year-old boy likes to do besides eat chocolate. What does a 5-year-old girl like to talk about? He knew nothing. The ignorance was humiliating, but it was also a roadmap. He had a week to learn. A week to study the most important subjects of his life. He walked out of the office, leaving the clean whiteboard behind. The elevator ride down felt different this time. He wasn't descending from a throne. He was stepping onto a playing field. When he exited the building, the air was fresh, crisp. He hailed a cab instead of using his car. He wanted to be among people. He wanted to watch parents with their children. He wanted to learn. He got in the back seat. Where to, sir? The driver asked. Alexander looked at the photo one last time before putting it in his pocket. The park, he said. Central Park. Near the playground. The playground, sir? The driver sounded surprised. It's early. Most kids aren't out yet. I know, Alexander said, looking out the window as the city began to move. I have a lot of watching to do. He leaned back, closing his eyes. The pride was still there, a dull ache in his chest, but the regret was steering the ship now. And for the first time, he was letting it. He was letting the pain of the lost time guide him toward the future. He wouldn't waste another second. The week had begun. The transformation had started. And Alexander Thorne was finally ready to become push swings, noting the way they spoke to their daughters, the patience in their voices when explaining something simple. He bought books on child psychology, reading them late into the night in the empty penthouse, highlighting passages about trust and attachment. He practiced smiling in the mirror, trying to soften the hard lines of his face, trying to look approachable, trying to look like a father instead of a CEO. He deleted 3 drafts of text messages to Clara before sending a simple confirmation on Friday night. See you at noon. She replied with a single word. Okay. Saturday morning arrived with a sky the color of brushed steel. Alexander woke up before his alarm, his heart beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He showered, dressed in casual clothes, khakis and a blue button-down, no tie, no suit jacket. He wanted to look soft. He wanted to look human. He drove himself this time, no driver, no barrier between him and the road. The GPS guided him away from the city center, into the suburbs where the streets were lined with maple trees and houses had actual yards. He pulled up to the address Clara had sent. It was a modest colonial house, painted white with black shutters. There were toys scattered on the lawn. A tricycle, a bright red ball. It looked lived in. It looked like a home. His penthouse looked like a museum. This looked like a life. He parked the car and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. He checked his watch. 11:55 a.m. 5 minutes early. Not too early, not late. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of cut grass and damp earth. Just be there, he reminded himself. Listen. He stepped out of the car and walked to the front door. Before he could knock, the door opened. Clara stood there. She was wearing jeans and a soft sweater, her hair loose. She looked less like the woman from the gala and more like the woman from his memories, but stronger. Her eyes scanned him, checking for suits, checking for entourage, checking for signs of the old Alexander. She found none. "You're on time," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I promised," he replied, wiping his shoes on the mat. He noticed a row of small sneakers lined up neatly by the door. His heart gave a painful thump. They were real. They were here. "They're in the living room," Clara said, her voice low. "Remember what we discussed. No pressure. If they walk away, let them. If they ask questions, answer honestly. Don't promise anything you can't keep." "I understand," Alexander said. He looked at her, seeing the tension in her shoulders. She was protecting them, even from him, even now. "Thank you, Clara. For this." She didn't smile, but she nodded slightly. "Go on." He walked down the hallway. The walls were covered in drawings, crayon scribbles, handprints, photos of the twins at different ages. He stopped to look at one. It was them at age 3, blowing out candles on a cake. He wasn't in the picture. He felt a sharp stab of guilt, like a needle in his chest. He continued to the living room. It was warm, filled with sunlight and the smell of popcorn. They were sitting on the floor, building a tower out of wooden blocks. Leo looked up first. Mia followed a second later. They stared at him. He stopped in the doorway, feeling suddenly enormous, an intruder in their sanctuary. He slowly lowered himself to the floor, sitting cross-legged, keeping his distance. "Hello," he said softly. Leo narrowed his eyes. He had Alexander's eyes, but the expression was entirely Clara's. Skeptical. Guarded. "Who are you?" Leo asked. His voice was clear, unafraid. Alexander swallowed. He had rehearsed this. "My name is Alexander. I'm a friend of your mom's." Mia tilted her head. "Mom has lots of friends. Why are you here?" "I wanted to meet you," Alexander said. He kept his hands visible, resting on his knees. "I heard you were building a tower. It looks very strong." "It's a castle," Mia corrected him. She picked up a block and placed it carefully on top. "For the king." "That's a very important job," Alexander said. He resisted the urge to reach out, to touch their hair, to hug them. He kept his hands still. "Can I help?" Leo looked at his sister, then back at Alexander. "You can pass the blue ones. We need more blue ones." Alexander reached for the pile of blocks nearby. He handed a blue one to Leo. Leo took it without saying thank you. He examined the block, then placed it on the tower. The silence stretched, filled only with the click of wood on wood. Alexander felt a surge of affection so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. They were right there. He could hear them breathe. He could see the dust motes dancing in the light around them. But he also felt the distance. They were polite, but they were cold. They were treating him like a guest, not a father. He handed another block to Mia. She took it, looking at his hand. "Your hands are big," she observed. "Yes," Alexander said. "I guess they are. Did you build the castle in the city?" Leo asked, pointing toward the window, toward the skyline visible in the distance. "I helped build some of the buildings," Alexander admitted. "Are you rich?" Leo asked. The question was blunt, innocent, and devastating. Alexander paused. He looked at Clara, who was standing in the doorway, watching silently. She didn't intervene. This was his moment. "Yes," he said. "I have a lot of money." "Then why didn't you come?" Leo asked. He stopped building. He looked straight at Alexander, his eyes wide and accusing. "Mom said you were busy. But you have money. You could buy a plane. You could come anytime." The air left the room. Alexander felt the floor drop away beneath him. This was the question he had feared. The one he had no good answer for. He looked at Mia. She was watching him too, waiting. The trust in the room was fragile, like the tower they were building. One wrong move and it would collapse. "You're right," Alexander said, his voice thick. He didn't look away. He didn't make an excuse. "I could have come. I had the money. I had the time. But I made a mistake. I thought work was more important. I thought making money was how I showed love. But I was wrong." "Why were you wrong?" Mia asked. Her voice was smaller than Leo's, but just as sharp. "Because money doesn't hug you," Alexander said. He felt a tear prick his eye, but he didn't wipe it away. He wanted them to see. Money doesn't read stories. It doesn't eat chocolate pudding. I missed a lot of things. I missed your birthdays. I missed when you learned to walk. I wasn't here. And I am very sorry." Leo picked up another block, but he didn't place it on the tower. He held it in his lap. "You missed my birthday," he said. "I was 4. I wanted a dinosaur cake. I know, Alexander whispered. I wasn't there. Mom made a dinosaur cake, Leo said. But she cried when she thought we were sleeping. Alexander's breath hitched. He looked at Clara in the doorway. She had turned her head away, her hand over her mouth. He looked back at Leo. I didn't know she cried, he said. If I had known, I would have come. But I wasn't paying attention. I was selfish. Selfish is bad, Mia stated. Yes, Alexander agreed. It is. And I was selfish. I want to try to be better. Not because I have money, but because I want to know you. If you let me. Leo looked at the tower. It was wobbly now. He looked at Alexander. Can you fix it? It's going to fall. Alexander reached out slowly. I can try, but you have to tell me where the block goes. Here, Leo said, pointing to the base. It needs to be strong at the bottom. Alexander placed the block where Leo indicated. His hand brushed against Leo's small fingers. Leo didn't pull away. It was a small thing, a tiny contact, but it felt like a bridge being built. Is that better? Alexander asked. Yes, Leo said. He looked at Alexander again. You can come back, but only if you promise not to be selfish again. I promise, Alexander said. The words felt heavy, sacred. I promise I will try my best. Okay, Leo said. He went back to building. Mia handed Alexander a red block. We need red now. Alexander took the block. His hand was shaking slightly. He looked up at Clara. She was watching him, her eyes wet. She gave him a small, barely perceptible nod. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was acceptance. He had survived the interrogation. He had answered the hard questions. And they were still letting him sit on the floor. The hour passed quickly. They didn't talk much more about the past. They talked about school, about the dog they wanted but couldn't have, about the best flavor of ice cream. Alexander listened. He didn't check his phone. He didn't look at his watch. He just existed in the room with them. When noon turned to 1, Clara stepped into the room. Time's up, she said gently. Lunch. The twins stood up, leaving the tower standing. Leo looked at Alexander. Bye, he said. Bye, Leo. Bye, Mia, Alexander said. He stood up, his knees cracking slightly. He felt drained, emotionally exhausted, but lighter than he had in years. He walked to the door with Clara. You did okay, Clara said quietly as he stepped onto the porch. They asked the hard stuff. I know, Alexander said. He looked back at the house. Through the window, he could see them running to the table. It hurt, but it was necessary. It will get harder, Clara warned. Next time they might not let you build the tower. They might want you to leave. Then I'll sit on the porch, Alexander said. I'll wait. I'm not going anywhere, Clara. I know I have a lot of work to do. But I'm ready. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, the hardness in her eyes softened. Okay, she said. Next Saturday. Same time. Same time, Alexander confirmed. He walked to his car. He didn't get in immediately. He leaned against the door, looking up at the sky. The sun was breaking through the clouds now. He placed his hand on his chest, over his heart. It was still beating fast, but the pain was different now. It wasn't the pain of loss. It was the pain of growth. He had faced the truth. He had faced his children. And he was still standing. He got into the car and started the engine. He had a week to prepare again. A week to prove he wasn't selfish. A week to become the man Leo and Mia needed. He drove away, leaving the house behind, but taking the feeling echoed in the cabin, louder than the engine. He had survived the first encounter, but survival wasn't the goal. Integration was. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He had promised to be better. He had promised to stop being selfish. But as the city skyline came into view, a new challenge loomed on the horizon, one that threatened to complicate the fragile peace he had just established. 3 weeks passed. The routine became a ritual. Every Saturday at noon, Alexander parked his car 2 streets away and walked to the house. He brought no gifts, only himself. Sometimes they built with blocks. Sometimes they drew. Sometimes they ignored him completely, playing tag in the yard while he sat on the porch, watching, waiting. It was humbling. It was exhausting. And it was the most alive he had felt in years. Clara remained guarded but observant. She watched him with the children, noting every interaction, every tone of voice. She was the gatekeeper, and he was the petitioner. But within the walls of Thorn Industries, the machine of business continued to turn. It was a Tuesday morning when the opportunity arose. Alexander was in a board meeting, reviewing the plans for the new waterfront development, the crown jewel of his upcoming projects. The design team was presenting concepts, but something was missing. The structures were solid, profitable, but they lacked soul. They lacked the warmth that made a building feel like a home. "The aesthetic is too cold," Alexander said, interrupting the presentation. He leaned forward, tapping the table. "It's steel and glass. It's efficient, but it's not inviting. We need something that blends with the community, not something that dominates it." His lead architect shifted uncomfortably. "We've tried several approaches, Mr. Thorne, but finding a firm that can handle the scale of this project while maintaining that level of intimacy is difficult." Alexander's mind drifted. He thought of Clara's office. He remembered the photos on her wall, the warmth of her living room, the way she had built a life that felt real. Or a design. She had the talent. She had the vision. And she needed the exposure that a project of this magnitude could provide. But proposing it felt dangerous. Mixing business with their fragile co-parenting arrangement could blow everything up. If things went wrong professionally, it could jeopardize his access to the children. If she felt he was using the contract to control her, she would shut him out. He dismissed the team early. "Send me the RFP," he said. "I'll review the vendor list personally." Alone in the office, Alexander stared at the city below. He picked up his phone. He scrolled to Clara's number. He didn't call. He emailed Marcus. "Prepare a proposal for Aura Design. Waterfront project. Standard rates. No preferential treatment. Let them bid like everyone else." It was a compromise. He wouldn't give it to her outright, but he would ensure her firm was in the room. It was a way to support her without charity. A way to respect her professionalism. 2 days later, the invitation was sent. Alexander waited anxiously. Would she accept? Would she see through it? On Thursday, Marcus knocked on his door. "She submitted a bid," Marcus said, placing a folder on the desk. "And she requested a meeting. With you. Specifically." Alexander's heart skipped. "Me? Not the procurement team. She said the vision requires the owner's input," Marcus replied. "She's confident. Maybe too confident." "Schedule it," Alexander said. "Friday. Her office. I'll go to her." Friday morning arrived with a tension that felt like static electricity. Alexander dressed carefully. No suit. A blazer, dark jeans. Professional but approachable. He drove to Aura Design. The office was located in a renovated warehouse district, full of exposed brick and natural light. It was vibrant. People walked around with fabric swatches and sketches. It was the opposite of the sterile silence of Thorne Industries. He was ushered into a conference room. Clara was already there. She stood by the window, looking out at the street. She wore a sharp navy blazer, her hair pulled back. She looked every bit the CEO. When she turned to face him, her expression was neutral. Business Clara. Not Mom Clara. Not ex-wife Clara. "Alexander," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for bidding, Clara," he replied, sitting down. He kept his hands on the table, visible. "Your proposal was impressive." "It was honest," she corrected, opening a folder. "I didn't lowball you to get the contract. I priced it based on the value we bring. If you want cheap, go elsewhere. If you want quality, you're looking at the right firm." Alexander smiled faintly. "I don't want cheap. I want the best. That's why you're here." "Let's make sure that's why I'm here," Clara said her.